Welcome all. My name is Ralph Benko. I am Senior Advisor Economics to American Principles in Action. This is a very important and portentous day at a very important time of the life of America. 100 years ago, two catastrophic events beset the world. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, plunging the world into World War I, and the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Maybe equivalent, but the Federal Reserve System might have been a little more catastrophic if you take the longer view. The point being here, though, that the beginning of World War I was the beginning of 100 years of all-out war for the entire world. And the gold standard always is the first casualty of all-out war. There have been four major public intellectuals who have kept the torch lit beside the golden door, as the Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty says. That is Louis Lerman, Ron Paul, Sean Filer, and Steve Forbes. Okay, these four champions have kept the reputation of gold alive through this long, dark age. Now, even though the world is full of unrest, the guerre à outrance, the existential warfare in which America could be destroyed, is over. We won. We beat the emperors. We beat the tyrants of Western Europe, Hitler, Mussolini, and so forth. We beat the tyrants of the East, such as Stalin and the Eastern European dictators. And now, just now, for the first time, the gold standard, which has been kept alive in reputation by these four men and some other people here like Larry Parks and other true champions of liberty, it trembles as a distinct possibility. Steve Forbes has written a magnificent book called Money. Steve, the subtitle, The Destruction of the Dollar and what we can do
how
about
the
it.
destruction of the dollar perils the world and what we can do about it.
It's a masterwork. It is Hayekian in its incisiveness, but it is also as easy, just as easy to read that even a mere layman like I was able to fully understand it or praise it, or at least so I like to think. Okay, this together with Louis Lerman's The True Gold Standard and Money, Gold, and History, and a handful of other books, is the architecture for how, not just whether, not just what to do, but how to restore America to vibrant, equitable prosperity. Now, having the roadmap by Lerman and Forbes and so forth is critical, but the other critical factor is rallying the people. The monetary policy has been off the books, has been off the dialogue for a long time now. It was kind of relegated after 1933 when FDR revalued the dollar and confiscated private gold. It just hasn't been a subject much talked about. That's rare in the history of the United States. Monetary policy was always a ringing good debate, which the easy money people like William Jennings Bryan, thou shalt not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, always lost. He ran for president 3 times and lost 3 times. McKinley won and instituted the Gold Standard Act of 1900. This was a central campaign debate, and it wasn't just a Republican issue. Grover Cleveland, I almost said Grover Norquist. Grover, you here? No, darn. Grover Cleveland was a progressive Democrat who understood the importance of the gold standard to working people and fought for it and won. This is a whacking good fight that America is ready to have again, and the man who has committed himself, Steve Lonegan, and who I welcome as the 5th great pillar of restoring monetary integrity and with it, equitable prosperity, where we can all double and quadruple our wealth within 2 generations, as was the case under the gold standard. We now have a new champion to welcome, Steve Lonegan, who is going to build the MoveOn.org on behalf of monetary integrity called FixTheDollar.com. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I don't think I need that, Ralph. It's great to be here, particularly with Mr. Forbes and such a terrific team. Americans are being squeezed in the vice of stagnating wages and rising cost of living. And we're watching the American dream evaporate into myth because we're watching the loss of our liberties. You know, I've been in the conservative movement for a lot of years, folks, and for years I have heard over and over again about how government's getting bigger and government's getting larger. And we go to conservative conventions and we'll see videos of Ronald Reagan talking about how the only thing, the closest thing to immortality on earth is a government program. And he's right. But I've been hearing this for 40 years, 30 years, 25 years. And it's become boring because it doesn't stop. Because Republican, conservatives, libertarian, and even liberals rail about the size of government. And nobody's done anything about it. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. We watch the national debt exploding to a staggering number of 17 trillion, one we cannot even fathom. We see massive government deficits. We watch our tax burden getting larger and larger, and the middle class being crushed. President Obama says the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. He blames capitalism. The rich are getting richer, and the middle class is getting squeezed. And the quality of life that many of us in this room have been accustomed to in the 50s and the 60s and 70s is diminishing. Not because of free market capitalism, but because of the failed policies of the Federal Reserve Bank that is debasing the American dollar, the very cornerstone of our economy. Let me turn you on to a little hint. There is no free market in this country, folks. It doesn't exist. I belong to an organization that worked very hard for years, many of you know, Americans for Prosperity, and advocating for free markets. Problem is we don't have a free market. And we cannot have a free market in this country as long as we have money that's controlled by central planners who determine its value, to decide how much we're going to produce. You know, there's one law of economics that every American knows, even if they didn't graduate high school, that's called supply and demand. The more you have of something, the less value it becomes. In the last decade, the supply of money, what's called the M1 money supply, the amount of cash and bank deposits out in the economy, went from $664 billion only a decade ago to $2.79 trillion today. That's an increase in the money supply over 400%. So what happens? The value of money decreases. We have a Federal Reserve Bank that prints money out of thin air, out of nowhere. In fact, we don't even have the value of money being printed out of thin air because they just make digital deposits in the accounts of the big banks. So you don't even have those pieces of paper. So the American dollar, that sacred little document, call it, or note that we held so dear, that we trust and believe in, this piece of paper, which was once backed by real value. You know, there was a time years ago that you would walk into the bank, you could walk into the bank with your dollar bill and get your share of silver, or silver coin, or redeem it for something called gold. The top of a bill used to say, silver certificate. Some of us remember that, or what have you. Now it's a Federal Reserve note. Redeemable for what?
Federal Reserve.
Redeemable for what assets the Federal Reserve has. I would argue that you can take your Federal Reserve note, go into the bank and ask for your fair share of a subprime mortgage portfolio. That's basically all it is. Hey, Mr. Banker, can I have that piece of that house that's underwater? You know, in the years, and I don't want to get into the depths of economic lessons. We know in our hearts, Americans know right now that there's a problem. They know there's a problem with this country. We're watching the American dream slip away. We've become accustomed to interest rates that are so low that an American saver who's worked hard and saved all their lives can't get a return on their income. We're accustomed to mediocre, high unemployment rates, kids coming out of college and living in their families' homes. That's the new norm. But that's not the American dream. And that's not the way it should be. If we had real money, if we had money backed by gold, if we did not have this exploding ability to print money out of thin air by a bunch of central planners, we'd have real economic prosperity, just like we had in this country for the 40 years prior to Richard Nixon's ending the gold standard in 1971. You know, I grew up in the 60s, and we used to play like millionaire games, right? I came from a blue-collar working family, and the idea of having $1 million was phenomenal. I mean, if you saved $1 million, then you were rich, and nobody could tell you what to do. And there used to be that show, remember a show back in the 60s called The Millionaire, where a guy would walk his hands and he'd $1 million, and people were like so happy. If you've worked hard in this country and you've saved, like my mom did a nursing home right now. Single mother, my dad died when I was a kid. She actually worked not far from here for 35 years at St. Vincent's Hospital, scrimped and saved and lived the kind of frugal life that we learn to be as Americans, to accumulate capital. Save $1 million. Go to the bank. Put your $1 million in a safe bank, FDIC insured CD for $1 million, and your interest rate's about $10,000 a year. That's not enough money to pay your rent. It's not enough money to have a decent life. You'll eat away at that safe, and why? Because the Federal Reserve Bank is keeping interest rates at a rate so low that a saver is now relegated to being obsolete. We don't need savers in this country anymore. Why should we? Why do we need savers to save money and put money in the bank so that the bankers can loan it and pay us a fair interest? The Fed can just print it out of nowhere. And that's a tragedy, because at the base of free market capitalism is the ability to save money, accumulate capital to invest in the means of production. When savers become obsolete, so goes the free market. When workers' wages remain stagnant, when the cost of living increases higher than their increases in salaries, whether it's laborers and labor union workers or government workers, so goes the middle class. The battle ahead, the single most important battle in this country, is to take back the value of our money. And there was a time not long ago, folks, that Americans took the value of their money very, very seriously. Ralph Benko spoke about this. You may not realize this, but back in 1904, in the wake of those campaigns which were argued over monetary policy of William Jennings Bryan, Frank Baum wrote a little story called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Americans engaged in monetary policy. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was a metaphor on monetary policy. Oz being an ounce of gold. The path, the gold, the yellow brick road being the gold standard. In the original book, Dorothy, who was the average American's slippers, were silver. Americans engaged in this debate because they understood the danger of paper money. I ran last year, as many of you know, in a pretty tough and dynamic campaign for the U.S. Senate. When I came off of that race, I needed to decompress, and I wanted to go back and do some reading. So I pulled an old book off the shelves I had read years ago, and I'm at that point in my life where I appreciate now better the classics I was forced to read in high school. It was called The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But go down to the fourth paragraph, when that terrific novel about the tragedies of the terror of the French Revolution, Charles Dickens, in one sentence, explains what brought on the social upheaval that was the French Revolution. Dickens writes, France had engaged in the printing of money and spending it, destroying the value of the French franc, driving up the cost of commodities for the middle class, and causing a social revolution. In Hungary, early part of the last century, we saw Hungarian money collapse into nothing, being shoveled into sewers. We saw the German Deutschmark crash and burn. In Zimbabwe, not long ago, a once vibrant economy in the 80s, through the printing of money, Zimbabwe watched their money collapse. But in all of these countries, in the last 100 years, when their money collapsed, they had another money to fall back on, the American dollar. What happens when the American dollar collapses? I'm not predicting its collapse. There's no proof to say that's going to happen in the near future. That would be apocalyptic. But if you're a middle-class family and your home is in foreclosure and you're out of work, you're living in your own little apocalypse. See, in free market capitalism, it's about millions of people making decisions that are best for them. It's the catalytics of economic growth. And when you pick away one at a time each individual over time, you diminish the economy and you become accustomed to a new norm of low unproductivity and a diminished American dream. Regaining and recapturing the value of the American dollar, taking control of our money away from the central planners and giving back to Americans, as, by the way, is designated in the United States Constitution under Section 8, Article 1, which states that Congress is responsible for the coinage of money and determining its value, not some pseudo-public entity, mysterious group called the Federal Reserve System. It's Congress's responsibility, and they've abdicated that responsibility. We have a job as Americans. We're going to launch that job right here today at this restaurant. The reason we're here is that in 1904, this was built as the Real Estate Bank of New York. Railroad tracks were laid to right from the harbor up to this point to bring these vaults that you're looking at so that they could store gold and silver in these vaults to back up the money, the notes that they were issuing prior to the reform of the Federal Reserve Bank. This is the single most important issue this nation's facing. Without control of your savings, you don't control your liberty. Without control of your money, you don't control the value of your wages and your labor. With giving control of our money to bureaucrats, we give up control of our economy and our destiny. We cannot allow that to happen. So we have work to do. What I'm going to do, what you and I are going to do, is fix the dollar through our American Principles in Action effort. We are going to get out to states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Florida, and we're going to force these candidates who want to be president of the United States, both Democrat and Republican, to take positions on this issue. We want congressmen and senators to understand and take positions on this issue. I'll tell you right now that what they're saying is, well, we don't hear about this from our constituents, so they're going to hear about it now. We have an issue that goes to the heart and soul of every working mom, working guy, and family and businessman understands the value of their money. We need to make this the #1 candidate, the #1 issue for our candidates for president. And we need a president in the White House who's going to put an end to the madness, unbounded printing of money by the Federal Reserve Bank, and reestablish a gold standard. Let's lift that torch behind aside the golden door, and as the great poem on the Statue of Liberty says, and restore a golden opportunity for the future of this country. That's why we're here today. I hope you'll join this effort. It is the single biggest effort we're going to see in the decades to come. Thank you for being here, and we bring Ralph back up again. Thank you.
I actually got confused. It was supposed to be Steve and then Steve, but instead you're getting Steve and then Steve. Steve Forbes is a remarkable man and from a remarkable lineage. How many of you have heard the story about Jekyll Island, about how the Fed was created at Jekyll Island? A number of you. Larry Parks, you've heard that story. Pay attention. I think you're the one who told it to me. That story was unknown until it was collected and published by B.C. Forbes in his extraordinary book, The Men Who Were Making America, Steve's grandfather. Okay. And then the lineage went to Malcolm S. Forbes, still remembered for his wonderful showmanship, the hot air balloons, buying Jefferson's bottles of wines previously owned by Thomas Jefferson, wonderful birthday parties in exotic places with movie starlets and stars and so forth. Extraordinary. And then, and of course the motorcycles. Steve, if I'm leaving anything out that's really essential, fill them in later, okay? Okay. And then a worthy successor at Malcolm S. Forbes Jr., known as Steve, who is chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, which has properties, I think, in 60 countries. Okay, and it has recently gone off on a new adventure, a la the Washington Post, to leverage this magnificent brand and to bring it into worldwide dominance, not just American dominance. Some of you remember when Steve ran for the President of the United States, won the Arizona primary, and brought the flat tax to wide public attention for the first time. And of course, he has collected the best stable of gold standard writers at Forbes.com, thanks to editor John Tamney of whom I modestly happen to be one. But he has cornered the market on gold standard columnists, if not quite on gold. His book, Money, is indispensable. I urge you to all go out and read it. If you buy it at the discount offered at Amazon.com, because they like to discount the purchase price, it turns out to be sold for $20.67, which was the classical iconic definition of the dollar, $20.67 an ounce before FDR revalued it to $35 an ounce. Coincidence? I think not. So let us all welcome here Steve Forbes.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph, and thank you, Steve, and thank all of you for coming here, Larry and others. And it is a great pleasure to be here. I'm always up for free food, free stuff, and during these turbulent times. But as Steve indicated, money is critical. And to say that, people will say, yeah, well, so what? But think about it. You can get it right on taxes. You can get it right on regulation. You can get it right on government spending. But if you don't get the money right, it's all for naught. Why? Because money facilitates transactions with each other. Trading. If we don't trade with one another, do transactions with each other, we don't get a higher standard of living. We'd still be living in caves. Each of us as an individual can't do everything on our own. So, you want to bake a cake and sell a cake. You trade to get the ingredients, the eggs, the flour, the sugar. Get the equipment, the ovens, the utensils. Get a contract to get a truck to deliver the cake. All of these things require transactions. We do billions of them each day. Money facilitates those transactions. But if you don't get the money right, then you're not going to get the kind of transactions and investing you need, and we're not going to get a higher standard of living. We will stagnate. So it facilitates trade, but it does more than that. It promotes trust and cooperation. If money is good, we can deal with strangers. We don't have to do a background check. Give them the money, and we can do deals with one another. So it breaks down barriers between people. You may not love your neighbor, but you want to sell to your neighbor. So it does all the things that liberals say they like. Money makes it possible. So in that sense, money properly understood is the root of all good, by breaking down barriers, enabling us to trade, enabling us to invest in the future. So, if you don't have sound money, then all of that goes to naught. It has to have a standard of value. For example, we have 60 minutes in an hour. Now imagine what your life would be like if the Federal Reserve was in charge of clocks. Imagine if they floated the clock. 60 minutes an hour one day, 52 minutes the next, 26 minutes, 80 minutes after that. You'd have to have hedges, derivatives, futures to figure out how many hours you're working. Let's say you're baking that cake. Just bake the batter 40 minutes. You have to figure out, is that nominal minutes? Inflation-adjusted minutes? Is that a New York minute, a Bangladesh minute, a Canadian minute? It'd be chaotic. So money measures value. Just as clocks measure time, scales measure weight, and rulers measure length. So money in and of itself isn't wealth, unless you have a rare coin, but it's a claim on products and services, like a coat check at a restaurant like this. Would be, so the idea that if you print up a lot of money out of thin air, you create prosperity is like a restaurant saying, if we do a lot of coat checks, we'll stimulate the production of a lot of coats. No, it's a claim on products and services. So if you undermine the trust in money, which as Steve indicated, whether it's a token coin, a piece of paper, or a blip on a computer, you get less investing in the future. As you all know, investing is a risky undertaking. Maybe 3 years, 5 years, 7 years with a drug, 10 years before you get a return. That's risky enough. But if you don't know whether you're going to get a 100-cent dollar, an 80-cent dollar, 10-cent dollar, $1.10, you get less investing. So when the trust in money is eroded, you get investing in the things that already exist. When anyone asks me, Should I invest in gold? I know we have a problem. Why would you invest in gold unless you're a jeweler? The reason you do it is an insurance policy, because you can't trust the authorities. And so you saw it in the 70s. None of you are old enough to remember the 70s. It's called pandering. I was in politics, but didn't do enough of it. Speaking of bank vaults. But in the 1970s, saw the same thing. Oil suddenly seemed to go from $3 to almost $40 a barrel. Now prices, as we know, just don't tell you what something may cost. It also gives you information about what people want and don't want. But when you corrupt money, it's like putting a virus in a computer. It corrupts the information. So in the 70s, when oil seemed to go up in price, what did that tell people? Oh, we must be running out of this stuff. So we poured tens of billions, hundreds of billions into energy. Oh, we're running out of this stuff. Well, in the early 80s, after that terrible inflation was vanquished, right, led by Ronald Reagan, oil crashed from almost $40 a barrel down to 10, finally stabilized at $20 to $25 a barrel. Countless thousands of wildcatters wiped out. Major oil companies like Exxon and Mobil had to merge. And you saw the same thing in agriculture. Commodity prices were going up, so therefore, oh, there must be shortages of corn and wheat. So fence post to fence post, fence post to fence post. Everyone bought land, going up in price, couldn't lose. Agriculture went into depression in the 1980s. Ben Bernanke the other day said, defending himself in a lawsuit about the illegal takeover of AIG, said, oh, we had to take extraordinary measures because this was the worst financial crisis in human history. He's got a short memory. The 80s were far worse. It's just this time policymakers were even dumber than they were in the 80s.
Yes.
But you had the savings and loan crisis. You had the top banks in this country about to go down as Mexico was going down.
Yes.
Far worse. In recent years, 500 banks have failed. In the 80s and early 90s, 3,000 failed. So Bernanke, supposed scholar of the Depression, all he learned about was helicopters, throwing money around, but so we've had worse. And the key thing is, virus in the computer. You couldn't trust prices. Today, oil's now $100 a barrel. How real is that? How much of that is crisis in the Middle East? How much of that is people speculating because they think it may go up nominally even more? You don't know. And so you get capital misdirected, as it was in the 70s and early 1980s. Think of it. They say, oh, this Labor Day weekend, gas was the lowest price in 4 years, $3.40. True, depending on the part of the country you live in. But let's go back a little bit. This kind of undermining doesn't go in a straight line. 12 years ago it was $1, $1.25. They don't want you to remember that part of it. In the last 15 years, over $1.5 trillion we've spent importing oil that we could have saved if oil still stayed at $20, $25 a barrel. Think of what you could do in your loan lives if you didn't have to spend so much on gasoline. Think of what we could have done with that $1.5 trillion we spent unnecessarily when we undermined the dollar. Think of the new products and services we'll never see. Think of the cures and medicine that we'll never see in terms of cancers and Alzheimer's and other diseases we need to fight. All those resources wasted that could have been used for a productive purpose to give us a higher standard of living. And so this is not just about economics. When people stop trusting money, they stop trusting each other. It undermines social cohesion, undermines the moral order. Lenin was right. Not 1 in a million will understand it when you debauch the currency. Locke was right. Father of our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, John Locke. He said when government arbitrarily changes to the value of money, it cheats people who entered private contracts with each other. Some may get a gain, some may get a loss, but only everyone loses. You saw it on the housing bubble, which we never would have had if the dollar hadn't been undermined. Bankers get the blame for it. Bankers responded to the virus in the computer. So with housing, They knocked artificial interest rates low artificially, so people borrowed who shouldn't have. They got shafted when the rates went up. Lenders got shafted. They're still paying for it today as the politicians loot banks. So when you have an undermined currency, you make a mockery of prudence, as we see today, mockery of thrift. Steve pointed out, you save, but you don't get a return on your money. Self-control is mocked. Cronyism is rampant. It seems like speculation is the way to get ahead instead of honest effort. And look at it this way. In the 40 years that we have been off a gold standard, our average growth rate is less than it was the previous 180 years that we are on a gold standard. And remember that 180 years encompasses World Wars, Civil War, Depressions, Great Depression, Forgotten Depression of the early 20s, all sorts of human catastrophes. Yet the average growth rate was higher than the last 40 years. If we had maintained gold standard growth rates, do you realize the American economy today would be 50% larger than it is now? Ponder that. $8 trillion bigger. Life would be a lot better. Now we'd still complain, the Yankees would still suck as they did last year. Some things don't change, some things don't change. But there's a reason why people feel that we're not moving ahead. And society turns on itself when it feels that mobility and the opportunity is being corrupted. They don't understand why. So we have to tell people why this is happening and what we can do about it. The thing about a gold standard is we did for 180 years. We can discuss the specifics of a new one, but as you all know, we're not talking about using gold coins. If you want to go to Walmart and use a gold coin, fine. Buy a pair of socks and give them a $1,300 coin. Very interesting. Go ahead. But it's like a ruler. Gold simply says this has a certain value. If you do it right, you don't even need to have much to back it up. Just one little statistic. Before World War I, Britain had about 1.5% of the global gold supply and ran the system pretty well. After World War II, because we didn't know what we were doing, we had about 40% of the gold supply, 700 billion ounces versus 7 million ounces for the Brits, and we destroyed the system. The key thing is knowing what you're doing. Gold is like a ruler. Just because it is 12 inches and a foot does not restrict the size of a house you may wish to build or a building you may wish to build, just as a unit of measurement. Gold is a measure of value. So the dollar stays fixed as value as you can in human affairs. It doesn't restrict the money supply. As my friend Nathan Lewis pointed out, from 1775 to 1900, when we started our quest for independence, American Revolution, small East Coast nation. 125 years later, we're 20 times the population, greatest industrial nation in the world. Dollar fixed to gold. Amount of gold in that time in the world increased only 3.5-fold. Yet the money supply increased 160-fold. Why? Because people knew the dollar value was fixed, like 12 inches in a foot, 60 minutes in an hour. So this idea that it's going to put us in deflation, all that kind of thing, nonsense. All it means is there's going to be more honesty. The government says it's going to stimulate the economy. Resources come from you. They don't come from Mars. The amazing thing is, why is counterfeiting illegal? Because it's a form of stealing. It's like stealing a claim, making it out of thin air. That's why it's illegal. That's why when you go to a store, you give them a $50 bill. They examine all sorts of ways. Yeah, when the government does that, prints money, it's called stimulus, or quantitative easing, instead of counterfeiting. Which is what it is. You create money in the marketplace, claims on products and services. The government may ratify it, but you're the ones who do it. So the bottom line on all of this is, since we have to trade with one another, work with one another, cooperate with one another, money facilitates that. If we don't do that, we stagnate. We don't develop our talents. And we turn on ourselves and on each other, as we've seen time and again in the last century alone. So you got to get the money right. If you get that right, you can commit a lot of other sins and still move ahead. If you don't get the money right, you can do a lot of other things right, but you're not going to move ahead. So this is the basis. It's a form of enabling us to work with one another, cooperate with one another, bring out our talents, enable us to take risks, learn from failures, and move ahead. It's the whole essence of the American dream. We undermine money. By the way, that 50% number, 50% larger, if we'd had growth rates throughout our history that we've had since we went off the gold standard in 1971, our economy today would be 1/4 the size it is now. Imagine taking a 75% cut in the standard of living. The amazing thing is the standard of living improves and we sort of take it for granted. There was somebody closing online the other day, Forbes.com, pointed out, you want to see how the standard of living moves up. Look at The Simpsons. Look at the first cartoons that came out 20 years ago. This middle class, lower middle class family, Simpsons. One car, few things in the house. Today, 2 cars, flat screen TV, like the old TV, handhelds galore. Things get better. Because it's gradual, we don't realize how things get better. Money is essential to doing that. If we don't get that right, then it's all for naught. These things here will be, like they are today, declarations rather than symbols of integrity and a vibrant future. Thank you.
It's my hope that this day, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of the money revolt, something as big, as powerful, and as important as the tax revolt was back in the 1970s that you're all too young to remember. But Steve and Steve, can you stick around for a few minutes and answer some questions?
Yes.
Are there any questions from the audience? Well, you're not the audience, but we'll give you privilege since you've got an official good camera there.
My question is to both of you would be, since we're here talking about fixing the dollar, how does the Bitcoin play into this situation on what's going on with the Bitcoin? Because there's still a lot of misunderstanding about Bitcoin also.
Well, there are 2 parts to Bitcoin. One part is it's a high-tech cry for help. And one of the things that you need when you get a new gold standard is remove barriers to alternative currencies as a safeguard. And the reason that Bitcoin is so dicey as money is that it doesn't have a fixed value yet. They haven't figured that out yet. So if you got paid in Bitcoins, you may get a ham sandwich one week and a glorious steak the next week. You don't know. They've got to work on that. But the other thing that Bitcoin is doing, I think, is creating an extraordinary payments processing system. Seamless. It's hard to believe when you do the swipe of your credit card, but the payments process system that we have today is very expensive. Ask any merchant what they pay for use of a credit card. And it's a very expensive system, but high tech is going to do to that what it's done to so many other things. Just make it simple, seamless, truly, much less costly. So Bitcoin is 2 things. What they call cryptocurrency, that's one part of it, that whole saga, which the authorities continue to try to crush. And the other, though, is a payment system that could be truly radical. So you've got to look at it from both sides, I think.
Okay. Identify yourself.
Oh, Ellen Sandals. I'm just curious how we're going to get the American people to understand this, because although we talk about Richard Nixon and the gold standard, this even started earlier in '64 under Johnson taking silver out of the coins. Because I remember when I was a little girl, my mother teaching me how to turn a coin on its side to figure out which was silver and had me trained to bring home those coins. Now, I thought everyone's mother taught them this. I did not know till decades later that nobody knew what I was talking about. So how do we take the American public, which is now oblivious, that this is really a core problem, and this this is why we're getting suffocated by government, and get them to understand. Ron Paul tried, but he wasn't talking in layperson's language.
There's no, it's not easy.
No.
We're not going to wave a magic wand and suddenly enlighten the whole world. However, there's a hunger for answers to what's happening to our economy. And this is, the way we're going to do this is the old-fashioned way, 4 yards in a cloud of dust. We're going to get out on the ground, we're going to go to any group that will listen, and over time we will build a network of people who will, it's going to be a bottom-up movement, calling on politicians, calling on the media. And it's just going to take hard work, but the advantage that we have is we're right on a critical issue, and Americans do get it. And they respond quickly, I've noticed in the presentations I make, they respond very quickly. They grasp it almost immediately. It's the throwback to 1900 when monetary policy was the center of political debate, and it can be again. The Federal Reserve Bank has done a remarkable job over the last years of wrapping themselves in complex statistics and mumbo-jumbo that nobody understands. So the Fed chairman gets up and makes some really disturbingly long and agonizing speech, and the media says, oh, okay, if you say so. And then they put out all kinds of statistics that nobody can comprehend. They don't matter. Those statistics don't matter. What matters is what's happening to your money and your buying power and your cost of living. We will make that, we will connect that, and we're going to do it through a ground game. You know, there was a Tea Party movement, there was Occupy Wall Street. All these were reactions to economic changes, a sort of a social upheaval. We can connect both sides. We can pull together labor unions, Tea Party groups, conservatives and liberals in understanding this issue. We have a winning formula here, we just have to make it work.
And the other key thing is that to remember, even if at the beginning it doesn't look like much is happening, you've got to set what you might call the intellectual foundations, so that if something happens in the news, some crisis comes up, people are sort of have an idea, this is what we should try to do. Because in the early 80s, after that terrible inflation, because of the lack of that foundation, we didn't go to a gold standard. Same thing in the crisis of 08 and 09. That should have been a perfect opening. It's what happens when you muck with the dollar. But the foundations weren't there. So this is both immediate, get candidates to know this is an issue, but also set the foundations so that if a crisis comes up again, we can respond and not wait for a disaster, and people will know how to respond. People say, well, don't we need a disaster? No, what we need is the foundations. So one, we can prevent the ultimate disaster, but if something askew happens, which happens all the time, you had that Portuguese bank go down the other day, which nearly wrecked Europe again, we're ready to say, yes, we did this for 180 years, we got to do something similar again. So it's both, setting the foundations, that's critical.
Sir.
Seems to me it's
Identify
always,
yourself.
oh yeah, Al Freck, New Jersey. It's always good to know the objections so that when you hear them, you can respond to them. I wonder if you could just detail a couple of the major objections that come up.
I think a lot of those objections, Al, you could address in Mr. Forbes' book. His book, which I read and studied, and has really addresses most of the arguments, or all of them that I can think of any matter, against the gold standard. But the objections are going to be, well, how do we convert to a gold standard? There's another ways of doing it. It's going to limit the amount of currency. That's not true. Mr. Forbes has already discussed that. I would just recommend reading that book.
Thank you. And one of the things they will do is use fear. People understand something's wrong with saying, if you go to gold, it's going to destroy the country like it did to the farmers. It's going to give us a new depression. They'll use fear. And so we provide a little bit of history on that. For example, in the late 19th century, where they say, oh, we had all these panics, not related to the gold standard, but they still tied to it. Locusts came out of the Midwest. Obviously, that's a gold standard thing. They come up. But the thing that Nathan Lewis pointed out in an essay he did for us a couple of years ago, during this supposedly terrible time of the late 19th century when farmers were starving and the world was coming to an end, industrial production in the U.S. from 1870s to World War I went up 682%. Most phenomenal growth in history. Wages doubled in real terms. Even though millions of immigrants were coming in, wages were going up. So why were immigrants coming? Wages were doubling. Industrial production was booming. Agricultural production was booming. If supposedly this was the time of plagues and locusts and Ben Bernanke wearing a farmer's suit, who knows? But fear is what they're going to ultimately rely on.
Sir, your name?
Yes, thank you. My name is Hugh Gilmartin, and I'm an accountant. And as an accountant, I want to know which of you on which is better, the flat tax or the so-called fair tax?
Out of order. Next. This is the gold standard here. We'll talk about that afterwards. Sir.
Is challenging the legal tender laws.
You are? Your name?
Is challenging the...
You want your name first?
Howard Samara. Is challenging the legal tender laws part of the strategy of fixing the dollar?
Constitutional
Uh,
provision for legal
no.
except by Congress.
Why not?
Well, as Steve, I will defer to Steve, but the organization that he represents, American Principles in Action, was profoundly effective in putting the gold standard into the discussion in the 2012 election cycle. You had Rick Perry talking about how Ben Bernanke was almost treasonous. You had Michelle Bachmann attacking fiat currency. You had Herman Cain, who published a book shortly thereafter, dropping out for other reasons, endorsing the gold standard. You had Ron Paul, who was closely identified with the Hayekian version of the gold standard. You had the Scott Rasmussen polling organization, polling 1,007 Americans, and twice as many of the respondents said they were for the gold standard as were against it. And by the way, the most enthusiastic constituencies for the gold standard, according to Rasmussen, number one most enthusiastic was African Americans. Number two most enthusiastic, union members, blue-collar labor. Only after that came conservatives and libertarians and Tea Partiers and so forth. So the theory that Steve has laid out is now that this organization is bigger and stronger, and you'll all help, right? Go to fixthedollar.com, sign up, and begin to focus the energies of the populist laser-like, can get the presidential candidates focused on the importance of good money and the wonderful historical record of the gold standard. Okay, that's where transformation is going to come from, not litigation.
And on legal tender laws, what you don't want to get caught up in is, even though we understand it, it just throws up too much dust right now. People like the idea of convenience of a single currency. That's why if we go to a gold standard, you have to remove the barriers to alternative currencies. So you're not going to take the dollar, you move barriers to alternative currencies. So if somebody, again, creates a Liberty dollar, they don't get called a financial terrorist and hauled off to jail. And removing taxes on gold and silver and things like that, then you deal with the legal monopoly in a way in which if it's abused, people have legal alternatives.
The other thing is that a movement, and this is a movement, has multiple parts to the machine. Mr. Forbes spoke about the academic foundation having a solid philosophical basis to work from, which he's provided in his books and writings at Forbes.com and others like Louis Lerman. You have the grassroots component. That's where we come in. Taking that academic argument and converting it into usable sound bites, getting messages to elected officials and to candidates, getting this through talk radio, getting on Mark Levin to talk about it, writing letters to the editor, sending out tweets and blogs, getting it out there. The other component is the legal part. There are organizations like the Institute for Justice and the Federalist Society. Hopefully we'll be picking up so much momentum that somebody will jump on the bandwagon and take on the legal aspects. That's how movements are built. So we need to build a team. And the team starts on the ground with us, with you in this room, to lead from here and be the disciples of sound money and begin to spread the word.
We're out of time.
We're out of time.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Maybe they'll maybe Steve will accept a few private questions afterwards.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for taking. Look, I just want to say one more thing. Look, I have people here from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island. I think I had all the states. And we did in this great little location. You got to admit, it was a lot of work to get here this morning, right? Yeah. So we wanted to make sure we only had people truly committed to the effort. So let's take it from here, folks. FixTheDollar.com. If you want us to come out and do our presentation on money to any of your groups, anywhere, I'll speak to anybody, anywhere. Labor unions, Rotarians, Tea Parties, Occupy Wall Street. We have the fabulous opportunity to take a core issue that cuts across party lines and political lines. Let's run with this and let's win. It's up to us to defend the future of the American dollar and the future of the American dream. So thank you.